Yeah, so let's have a little chat about climate change. It's an area that it's been around for a long time. It's sort of fell into some doldrums for a while here in Australia, but meanwhile it still continues on. So I've actually got a little bit of a recap on some of the trends and projections, and sort of a look at what industry is saying today, because that has evolved and changed, and who's taking action. Just got a couple of projects I've been working on there, and who will be the catalyst for change. And that's a really important discussion point that we can have at the end of the session. And I really look forward to your inputs. But first of all, you've got to start off with a joke. Climate change normally cops quite a bit of a joke, and there's always something in the papers around climate change and so forth, generally around the confusion between terms. And climate is obviously, well, it's not obviously, it is the long-term regional or global average temperatures, humidity, rainfall patterns, but basically it's all about years and decades and very, very long periods of time, where weather is all about minutes and what's happening in your local area. Quite different things. Global warming is all about the upward trend of emissions into the atmosphere, predominantly from fossil fuel use. And climate change just broadens global warming to encompass temperature-related changes and sea level rise. Just pop this one up here. It's very old. It's an older slide, but and the next few slides are a little bit older too. But it's just maybe it's a little bit of a matter of time before NASA gets shut down too. But they do actually have some really, really good research there. So if you want to look at what's happening globally, just pop on their website. But the effects and trends of climate change have been with us for a long time. 3,500 deaths in 2003 in a heat wave in Europe. 25% of Africa's population, that's more than 200 million people, experience high water stress. And what they're observing, obviously, is that droughts are becoming prolonged, particularly in the tropics and subtropical areas. The frequency of heavy rainfall events have increased, and really the rainfall intensity is a key area when you're working with your designers. This particular instance, 2005, more than 1 million people lost their homes. But closer to home, 2016, very recently, Julia Creek up in Queensland there. A great example of rainfall intensity and something to show to your flood engineers. This is the rail track here. This is the ballast, completely washed out. And they were experiencing, terrible, strong storms up there. But what you had there is convergence of overland flow paths. So once you get rainfall intensity building up, it's really important to talk with your design engine, with your flood modelers, about adding in different scenarios and rainfall intensity. Because what happens is exactly what happened there, where your convergence of overland flow paths and bang, washed out the ballast from under the rail track there. What's really unusual about that derailment is that all 13 carriages went over as well. So it could have been one of our worst environmental disasters. Fortunately, it wasn't, and most of it was contained, and the emergency services got there quickly and did a really good job. But our climate trends are basically telling us that, globally, and every year that seems to come out, we've had the warmest year since records have come about and so forth. But you can't deny a trend there that's happening. CSIRO tell us that we've gone up 0.9 degrees since 1910, and projections range from 1 degree to 4 degrees depending on atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Sea level rise going up 3.4 millimetres a year. And the sea level rise is related to global warming with two factors there. You've got the melting of ice caps and the expansion of water due to its warming. Sea level rise projections are anything from, for Australia here, 50 to 1.4 metres, depending on which scenarios you choose to use. But the elephant in the room with sea level rise is the West Antarctic ice sheets, where there's more than 5 to 6 metres. They're not quite sure. Once that destabilises from the ocean bed and the actual land areas, they reckon you could have massive amounts of ice just slipping through and going off and melting. It's something that they've chosen not to include in current scenarios. Some friends of mine worked quite a few years ago with OEH in New South Wales, and they did some mapping in Sydney Harbour just to try to demonstrate how relevant sea level rise will be. This is Fort Denison, the centre of Sydney Harbour there, and certain times a year, by the end of the century, that's what you'll be looking at as a flood level for your dining there. So you need to look at two things, whether they're open and quite how the tides are going. Climate variables. There's a range that we look at, and there's quite a bit of data out there, but predominantly it's these ones that people are most interested in your design area. You know, sea level rise, bushfire, temperature, rainfall, wind speed. Oceanographic projections, aerogate saturation, that sort of stuff. Never knew what that was all about until I talked to the durability guys. They're really interested. We're doing a couple of projects at the moment, looking at some harbour crossings of Sydney Harbour, and it's about the durability of the concrete that's going to sit on the ocean bed there, and the types of figures you can give them, because obviously you're looking at 100-year design life, these factors need to come in. What we'll be seeing is an acidification of the ocean, unfortunately, and all those things come into a factors to be considered in looking at the design lives that we have on our large infrastructure projects. Where's it all come from? Well, the IPCC put out 4 different, they call them RCPs, which are representative concentration pathways. This pathway here, we're not going to achieve that pathway, but it's this pathway here that we focus in on ourselves whenever we do our climate projections. It's still achievable, and I'll go through a couple of other reasons why in a moment. The CSIRO and the state government can take these and do further modelling and give you more localised results, but essentially they boil down to this. So why do we suggest that you stick with that 2-degree notion? Well, basically it accords with what the world signed off at Paris in 2015, is to try and limit warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century. And it's been pragmatic. You know, so many times I've come onto large projects and people have talked to me and said, Tony, what's this climate change bullshit? And you've got to, well, you don't need to, what it's about is just simply risk management. You don't necessarily have to believe in climate change at all. There's a trend, and it's something that needs to be considered just like you consider any other risk on your project. And it generally works with you. It's surprising how many people still don't believe in climate change. It's trained professionals, but that's their choice, their personal choice. But on a large project where we have sometimes over 300 engineers working in a large design joint venture, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. So it's just a risk management process. Why do we stick to 2 degrees as well? Because beyond 2 degrees, they tell us that we'll come to some sort of tipping point where essentially the world can't absorb any more atmospheric carbon, and so therefore we come to a cycle where when we hit somewhere before 3 degrees, 4 degrees becomes inevitability because it's just rebounding back up and through, and so you get a cyclic performance there. 4 degrees, you know, last time we were 4 degrees warmer as the world, that was 400 million years ago, and Antarctica was covered in rainforest, so it's a completely different world. So often on jobs I've inherited climate risk assessments where people have picked up like a 4 degree plus 4 degrees, and if we have a 4 degree warming, the world would be such a different place. So let's be pragmatic about what we choose to work with and say what the projections will be. What we do know is that we're probably all wrong. It will affect differently, but it's a trend. So let's just look at a trend and look at the risks. Who's exposed? We've got global populations there, 7.5 billion going up to 11.2 by the end of the century. We've got coastal populations. 3/4 of all large cities are potentially vulnerable to sea level rise. And at the moment, we've already got 200 million people dependent on glacial ice melts. When those glaciers don't reform again, then we're in trouble for a lot of people in other countries, not just on coastline. Environmentally, as I mentioned there, a very different planet with global warming, and a lot of species failing to adapt quickly enough and moving to different habitats and so forth. Financially, Paul Fisher recently retired from the Bank of England here. Very open in what he's been saying since he's left there. He said anybody who is a long-term asset holder is potentially exposed to climate risk. So let's have dive a little bit longer into what the industry is saying and who's taking action. The World Economic Forum. If you can hop on their website, they do some great stuff, really, really good communicators in a lot of different areas. But climate change, if you look over the last few years, has always been there in around about the top 3 of the trends which will basically determine global development. Centre for Policy Development here has been saying that the bar for directors is rising as the links between social and environmental factors and financial risks come into focus. Senior Counsel has been on a speaking tour last couple of years now. It says it's only a matter of time before we see litigation against a director who's failed to perceive, disclose or take steps in relation to foreseeable climate-related risk that can be demonstrated to have caused harm to a company. So quite a shifting landscape recently. The financial sector's view, again, this is Paul Fisher, just in expanding it a little bit more, but essentially he's put out a big call there, just really asking people to try and sweep politics aside, and it's simply a commercial business risk, just like any other that we need to take into account. So as I mentioned a few times, risk management, but we obviously do have quite a few other drivers. Green Star, the IS rating, GRESB, a few other tools like that, all have and value climate change actions that you introduce into your projects. But really, at the end of the day, you want to move to like a level 3 with ISCA, that sort of thing, where you actually have some tangible actions on your projects rather than just a consideration. But if that's all that can be done, that's great as a starting point. So climate risk assessment, essentially Australian standard, and it's all about, firstly, developing a risk statement, undertaking your risk assessment with the project team. Having your operator there is really important as well, because many people around the table as possible. Because what you're trying to do is identify adaptations and reassess that risk. So what's industry doing to understand climate change and reduce risk? Well, we've got a lot of projects at the moment that are taking up that challenge of understanding what the climate risks are to the project over its design life and building in appropriate adaptations. We've got precincts, and very encouragingly now we've got a few clients that have said, look, we've got a portfolio, what do we do? Sydney Metro Northwest is a big project I worked on for several years. Part of the design joint venture there, $3.7 billion worth of infrastructure going in there. But the key thing about that, what the outcomes were, as soon as I essentially went into that project, the first people I went to see was the flood modellers and see what they were up to, and to see what protection was being afforded to particularly your tunnel portals, critical infrastructure, and then other areas of your track and your station entrances and so forth. That's just a number of adaptations that went into that design. 15 kilometres of tunnel there and so forth. So you really, and it's being a greenfield site, it was predominantly greenfield, gave us a great opportunity obviously to go to some of the, getting design up to the PMF is great. A lot of projects you'll work on going through existing, like Newcastle Light Rail for instance, at the moment, another one I'm working on. You can't protect the PMF on that. You've actually got a situation where you've got a flooded valley and you've got a lot of regional issues within that project, so you have to come up with other adaptations to think more cleverly in your design. Queen's Wharf Precinct, recently done the climate adaptation plan for there. Another big development, $3 billion worth. 2011, large floods around that area, particularly in the areas that are being redeveloped there. So it's front and centre of a lot of people's minds. And so again, the water element of climate risk was front and centre. QIC, another client of ours at the moment, large real estate owner, 34 commercial offices and retail shopping centres, but also 25% holding in ports like Port of Melbourne, Port of Brisbane, Brisbane Airport, major utility pipelines and so forth. This one going all the way through South Australia, and 5.6 million hectares of farmland. So they, to their credit, they just wanted to understand what are all these different areas up to, what's happening in those areas in terms of climate change or likely to happen, and I'm just seeking to build some resilience over time into their assets. You don't have to do everything straight away. Prioritise them, come up with appropriate thresholds, and then move forward through some practical adaptations. So your actual adaptation responses, well, obviously the easiest one, well, not the easiest one, the nicest one possible to do is to avoid. You can't always do that, so then you adapt, then you defend, and then you retreat. So essentially they're the four key areas you work within, retreating obviously is the last one, but often you do have to, and you've got threats to human life and so forth and things like that to consider. So they're all risks that need to be treated along that continuum there. And essentially what you're trying to build is resilience, and it's all about your ability to recover quickly. Natural disasters happen. Unfortunately, they're happening even more regularly, and it's about building that resilience with your assets, so it's up and running quicker is really a key to your success. So we've got plenty of examples where this hasn't happened. This is 6 years after Hurricane Katrina. It's actually 12 years now since that hurricane happened, and there's still areas around that haven't been rebuilt since that hurricane hit. A great example of not being resilient and or having backup from your government. Energy security is another area where we're getting asked a lot of questions as well, which can be due to geopolitical strife, but it's more often than not due to natural disasters and so forth. And so obviously natural disasters and sort of coming with extreme weather is causing people a lot more concerns. The interesting thing about when you look up energy security is actually around some of the definitions. It's not just about the availability of energy, it's availability of affordable energy. And I think that's something we're going to see more and more problematic at times, because essentially your mitigations against this, if people aren't acting as a big group, then people then go back to the old days. We start putting, obviously you do have your energy retailers often have redundancies and so forth that they need to provide to you, but more and more people are considering what you actually have to do yourself. You've got large shopping centres and things like that. There's some backup power sometimes there already, but more so, what are your liabilities with your tenants and customers and so forth? What do you have to continue to supply power to when things back up? So resilience investment, it's another key area where unfortunately we just don't do it very well. Around 11% of economic costs and natural disasters are borne by state and federal governments. Federal government spends $560 million on post-disaster relief and recovery, as opposed to $50 million per year invested on pre-investment disaster resilience measurements. That's a factor of 10 to 1, and surely we need to start thinking about trying to reverse that or getting that closer, because without serious investment in the pre-disaster recovery, we're going to be in ever continuing expenditure for the post-disaster relief. So who will be the catalyst for change? I've only got a couple of more slides now, and then obviously I'd like to open it up to see who you think will be the catalyst to change. Change needs a consensus. People need to move as one, and climate change is such a big thing that globally that, I don't know, that there's often the view that, you know, someone else can do it, I don't need to bother, that sort of stuff. There's quite a lot of political polarisation along party lines, and more often than not choose to ignore the science of climate change. Will business be one where we can rely on to be a market leader? Often businesses, well, they are inherently pragmatic and they're used to change. Often because the marketplace is savage to businesses that ignore reality, but obviously businesses are well aware of risk, and they are well aware that future business can't be conducted in certain climates. But we can't sit back and expect it to happen. Businesses can be a powerful vehicle for change, but only if you get involved. Reward the ones that get it right, and you can have a successful business backed by values. So over the next 15 years, the world will require about 90 trillion in new infrastructure, most of it in developing and middle-income countries. Making the right choices in favour of infrastructure that is climate resilient and has a low carbon development pathway is critical and urgent. And action now will avoid huge costs later. That's not me saying it, that's the World Bank this year. So there's a huge challenge out there with climate change, but we've also got expanding populations and so forth, and it's one where having a consensus around what is the right way to move with it will be fundamental to the success of our infrastructure projects going forward in the future.
I wonder whether we should be looking at those societies and cultures that plan 100 years ahead, because we don't generally. Very, very few organisations plan for this period. And I think probably a lot of attitudes could be, well, if you're looking at your planning periods and the life cycle and all these things, it's out there, it's away from us. Japan seems to have a culture in business of planning for huge periods. Does Japan have a success in planning for climate change?
Yeah, they definitely have had, like you say, the long-term planning for a long time. I don't know in terms of climate change how they've actually addressed that themselves. Does anyone else know in the room how they've really looked at it? But as you say, like, there's inherently, because of the design life of the infrastructure assets we work with, we think about that already in terms of durability and other areas of our design. We have to really embrace the risk that could be posed through climate change, and it's not something you don't have to do everything straight away. Like, a lot of systems have got a 25-year design life within them, and if there's going to be sort of a 1 degree influence or half a degree or whatever over that 25 years, then you don't then jump immediately to the 2 degree and put that in now. You build that in, and you in the asset recycling of certain elements, it's a progressional thing, whereas other parts of infrastructure that's sitting on the ocean floor bed, if it's a tunnel and so forth, or crossing the harbours, then definitely you've got to look at it more seriously, at all the different risks that are posed through acidification of the oceans and so forth.
Any questions?
Hi, one of my questions to you is regarding the tools that you might be using in understanding resilience and costing resilience for the life cycle of infrastructure. And the second is to Patrick, probably because I think in the morning you discussed about full life cycle evaluation of the assets you're working on. Were you able to consider the resilience aspects of those infrastructure while costing full life cycle costs, or what tools do you think would be helpful in doing that?
Yeah, well, I think as we heard this morning, obviously if you can cut out having to replace and you can look at it over a long enough period, then often it actually pays for itself. An interesting project we were working with Transport for New South Wales on recently was their Sustainable Guidelines for Rail version 4, and a lot of the credits there are looking at whole life costing, and therefore we're trying to build in other externalities and so forth within those costing models. The availability of maintenance data is a gap, and often you have to make a lot of assumptions and things like that, but everyone's starting to do that and starting to think about it, and it's about starting it. It's not the perfect science straight away, but start plugging some stuff in there, valuing some of the externalities, social cost of carbon and other elements are legitimate things to value in whole life costing, but obviously you've got the straight capex and not having to replace 25 years time or 40, and then deferring that to 40 years, is definitely one that we need to think more on.
I think I understood your question. In our life cycle assessment, we factored in that in our base case, we did two versions. One of our base case, which factored in that all the design components would last at least as long as had been stated in the spec. And as an aside or as an assurance for that, the durability consultant has to sign up to those specified design lives. But then as a separate exercise, there's another credit there under ISCA, under climate change adaptation, I think it's called. And we have to do an assessment of the risks that pertain to our job. And it turned out, I think, more through good luck, that piece of land where our job was, the risks that were in play around things like flooding and bushfire, we could easily adapt our solution to without any additional expenditure. It was just a matter of awareness and addressing the solution. Things like upsizing drain pipes, allowing access ways in emergency, things like that. So it was done as a matter of course, and we think we've done all the adaptation that we could foresee being needed. But obviously we'll have to watch that as we go forward.
I've certainly worked on some projects where we've upsized some pipes, but we haven't done the land acquisition to upsizing some of the swales and so forth along the roadway. But all they're looking for is the future. So therefore, instead of really doing some major structural work to the bridge, they've actually got pipes in there which are slightly larger, but the swales and so forth, yep, there's a corridor which has been marked by roads, but they don't need to claim that yet because currently for the drainage solution works, but they know in the future we're likely to actually have to expand out into those areas. So it's progressional, I suppose, but trying to get in what needs to be done now at the lowest cost and then planning for the future.